Let's begin with what is arguably the most difficult but most necessary shift: emotional detachment. Not because it's cold or cruel or aloof, but because it's the only way out. You see, narcissists thrive in a terrain of emotional instability. That's their battlefield. It's not logic, it's not reason, and it's certainly not empathy. It's chaos, emotional chaos, where you're reacting, second guessing, apologizing, or justifying. That's their playground. And as long as you're playing by those rules, you're already losing. Now, most people believe that emotional detachment means shutting off all feeling, becoming a kind of blank slate, but that's not true. Detachment, in its highest form, is not the absence of emotion, it's the control of emotion. It's not that you feel less, it's that you don't allow your feelings to be used as weapons against you. And that's what narcissists count on. They rely on your emotional sensitivity, your empathy, your need to resolve conflict, to continue their cycle of control. When you engage, when you react, when you explode, or even when you beg for understanding, you feed the illusion of their power. They interpret every emotional response as validation that they still have access to your psyche. They don't hear your words, they sense your vulnerability, and that becomes the very crack they widen. But when you detach, when you begin to respond instead of react, when your emotional state becomes stable and internal rather than dictated by their manipulations, something unsettling happens, unsettling for them. They begin to lose their grip, not because you've told them off, or exposed them, or even retaliated, but because you've become unmoved. That's terrifying to a narcissist. Their identity is sustained through emotional reactions from others. No reaction, no identity reinforcement. In other words, when you stop playing, the mask begins to slip, and often they start to unravel. It's helpful to understand this in psychological terms. Narcissists have a fragmented sense of self. Their personality is not stable in the way most people's are. They build their identity externally through admiration, attention, and control. So, your anger fuels them, your tears fuel them. Even your attempts at love and reconciliation feed their ego, not their heart. When you detach emotionally, you take away that external source. They're left with themselves, and the truth is, they can't stand being alone with themselves, because behind the grandiosity is a hollow core, an internal void that they've spent a lifetime avoiding. Detaching doesn't mean you stop caring about yourself. On the contrary, it means you start. You start placing your well-being at the center of your decisions. You start filtering your thoughts through a different question. Is this reaction helping me, or is it feeding the cycle? That's when you regain sovereignty over your internal state. You begin to realize that you are not obligated to explain yourself, justify your choices, or absorb someone else's chaos just because they demand it. You are not a mirror for their emptiness, and when you stop reflecting their dysfunction, they're forced to see it for themselves, if only for a moment. Now, many will say, but if I stop engaging, won't that make them escalate? And yes, it might temporarily. You have to be prepared for that, because when a narcissist realizes they're losing control, they often double down. They'll test your boundaries, provoke reactions, or play the victim. That's predictable. But you must remember that surge is the death rattle of their control. If you hold your ground during that final chaos, they eventually retreat. Not because they've changed, but because you're no longer useful to them in the way you once were. And here's the philosophical layer to this. Emotional detachment isn't just a strategy, it's a form of discipline. It requires you to separate your values from your feelings. It asks you to become the kind of person who doesn't need external validation to maintain internal stability. And that kind of person, paradoxically, is deeply powerful, because in a world where manipulation is currency, clarity becomes resistance. Your calm presence becomes a fortress, your silence becomes wisdom, and your refusal to engage in the chaos becomes the loudest message of all. So if you want to outsmart the narcissist, don't argue, don't explain, don't beg, instead go quiet inside. Train your mind to see through the bait. Become unshakable, not because you feel nothing, but because you've chosen not to be moved by someone else's disordered world. You're not abandoning emotion, you're reclaiming it. You're not becoming hard, you're becoming whole. And when you can do that, when you can walk into a room with a narcissist and walk out with your peace untouched, that's when you win. Not with revenge, not with power plays, but with calm, intelligent restraint. And in that silence, they begin to hear the truth, the one thing they fear the most. Asterisk, asterisk, emotional detachment isn't the absence of love, it's the presence of self-respect, and when you master that, they lose everything and you gain yourself. Asterisk, asterisk, let's talk about boundaries. Not the shallow feel-good version of boundaries you see tossed around like a trendy self-help phrase, but the kind that disrupt the narcissist's entire framework. Boundaries aren't just about saying no, they are a declaration of identity. They define where you end and where another person begins. And for the narcissist, this is intolerable, because control depends on the erosion of those boundaries, emotional, psychological, even physical. When you start reinforcing them, what you're really doing is reclaiming territory they assumed would always be theirs. A narcissist doesn't just want your attention, they want your permeability. They want your thoughts to be open to their influence, your emotions to be predictable to their manipulation, and your actions to orbit their needs. So when you assert a clear, immovable boundary, you're doing something more radical than it appears. You're signaling that your internal world is no longer accessible on demand, and that shakes them. It shakes them because it threatens their illusion of dominance, the belief that they can provoke, manipulate, or guilt you into compliance. What makes boundaries so difficult, especially in relationships with narcissists, is that they will always frame your self-protection as betrayal. They'll accuse you of being cold, selfish, even abusive, and if you're empathic, if you're someone who's wired for connection and peace, that accusation can hit you like a freight train. But here's what you must remember: boundaries are not aggression. They are clarity, and clarity is something narcissists hate because their power depends on confusion, your confusion. When you say, "No, that doesn't work for me," or "I will not accept this behavior anymore," you're pulling the mask off. You're saying, "I see what you're doing, and I'm not playing along." That moment, right there, that's when the narcissist begins to panic. Not always outwardly. Often, they'll become more manipulative, more subtle, more performative in their reactions. They'll promise change, they'll feign insight, they'll deliver half-hearted apologies laced with blame. But what they're really doing is trying to dismantle the boundary you just built brick by brick. Because to them, boundaries aren't just inconvenient, they're existential threats. Why? Because the narcissist has no stable sense of self. They are fragmented, hollow, and entirely dependent on external regulation, meaning they rely on your reactions, your availability, and your vulnerability to define themselves. So, when you stop being accessible in the way they're used to, you don't just change the dynamic. You destroy the mirror, you force them to confront their emptiness, and very few narcissists can survive that with their illusion intact. But boundaries do something else too, something even more important than limiting the narcissist. They restore you. Every time you say, "I won't tolerate this," you reinforce to yourself that you are someone worth protecting, that you have value, that your time, your energy, your peace, all of it matters. And the more you act in accordance with that truth, the stronger you become, not just emotionally, but philosophically, because now your behavior reflects an inner structure, a set of principles that can't be hijacked by charm or rage or guilt. There's also a deeper ethical dimension to boundaries that people often overlook. You are not just protecting yourself, you are modeling reality. You are refusing to enable delusion. You are choosing to respond to dysfunction not with denial, but with discipline. And that discipline says there is a standard for how human beings should be treated, and I will not negotiate it down for the sake of false peace. Now, will this infuriate the narcissist? Yes. In fact, it might trigger their most desperate tactics. They might rage, they might ghost, they might triangulate you with others, spreading lies, painting you as unstable. Let them, because what they're actually doing is revealing how much they depended on your lack of boundaries to maintain the facade. Your resistance exposes their dependence, and that's something they'd rather you never see. But here's the reward, and it's not small. When you set and maintain boundaries, you don't just escape a toxic cycle. You emerge with a deeper, more integrated self, a self that no longer fears rejection because it no longer defines its worth by how much it can endure, a self that stands not in defiance but in quiet, unshakable dignity. So, don't apologize for protecting your soul. Don't flinch when your silence is called cruelty or your limits are called manipulation, because in a world of blurred lines and emotional coercion, boundaries are the highest form of truth. And the truth, no matter how much it offends the narcissist, is the only thing that will ever set you free. ***, real boundaries are not built to push people away. They're built to keep your identity intact. And when the narcissist finally realizes that they no longer have the key, that's when you've already won. ***, when you decide to walk away from a narcissist and then remain silent, something deeply unsettling begins to unfold within their psyche, something they've spent a lifetime trying to avoid. The collapse of their illusion of control, and it's in your silence that one of the most profound shifts occurs. Not because silence is passive, but because, paradoxically, it's one of the most powerful forms of communication. It denies the narcissist what they crave most, a reaction, and in doing so, it initiates a psychological void they are profoundly unequipped to face. The narcissist's sense of control is not rooted in healthy influence or mutual understanding. It is rooted in manipulation, in the subtle calibration of your behavior through guilt, gaslighting, praise, punishment, and emotional volatility. Their control depends on your engagement. They need you to protest, to plead, to argue, to validate their existence through emotional response. Because, as long as you are reacting, even negatively, they still feel like they matter. They still feel like they're the center of your psychological universe. But when you go silent, genuinely silent, not as a strategy, not as a tactic to provoke them, but as a firm act of withdrawal, of self-possession, of no longer consenting to be their mirror, that's when the real unraveling begins. You are no longer supplying them with emotional energy, and the narcissist cannot self-regulate without it. Their entire identity, which is externally scaffolded by the responses they evoke in others, begins to crumble. That's why silence is not a void, it's a confrontation, and it's far more terrifying to them than any angry outburst ever could be. You see, control for the narcissist is not about leading or guiding, it's about survival. They fear abandonment more than anything else, but not in the way healthy individuals do. It's not the fear of loneliness, it's the fear of non-existence, because the narcissist doesn't have a cohesive internal self to fall back on. They are what the psychoanalyst Heinz Koh had called a false self, a patchwork persona assembled to elicit admiration or compliance. Remove the audience, and the act falls apart. When you walk away and you go silent, you do more than exit a toxic cycle. You force the narcissist to sit in their own unresolved emptiness. You leave them with their own echo, and that echo is not kind. It is filled with every criticism they've deflected, every shame they've projected, every truth they've denied. They'll try to numb it with distractions or scapegoat someone new or invent a new narrative where you're the villain, but underneath all of that there's a reckoning happening, and it's not on your stage anymore. It's behind their closed curtain. Now, many people fear this stage. They worry the narcissist will retaliate, smear their name, or find ways to manipulate their silence. And yes, those risks exist. But that's also why your silence must be firm, not fragile. You're not playing a game, you're not participating in their theater. You've left the building, and in doing so, you've begun to assert something they can't steal or distort: your autonomy. This isn't just a psychological strategy, it's a moral stance. Because continuing to feed the narcissist with emotional responses, even in anger, reinforces their belief that they're entitled to your inner world. Silence says, "You are no longer welcome here," and it says it with such clarity that no words are needed. That kind of silence is not the absence of communication. It is the presence of strength, and it has ripple effects beyond the narcissist. It begins to reshape you, because as you maintain that silence, you begin to hear your own voice again, unobstructed, untainted, undistorted. You remember who you were before the chaos, before the triangulation, before the emotional whiplash, and you begin to rebuild not just boundaries, but a life one that no longer centers around someone else's broken mirror. The narcissist will likely experience this silence as a form of annihilation. They'll scramble for ways to draw you back in through pity, rage, guilt, seduction. They'll test your silence like a prisoner testing a fence, looking for weak spots. But every time you resist the urge to engage, you reinforce the reality that you are no longer theirs to manipulate, and that truth, more than any speech, confrontation, or outburst, is what truly strips them of power. So don't underestimate the power of silence. It is not empty, it is full of meaning. It speaks the language of boundaries, of dignity, of freedom. It's not about revenge, it's about revelation. Your silence reveals the truth they've spent their lives running from, that they do not control you. And in that revelation, you not only reclaim yourself, you dismantle their illusion. Asterisk, asterisk, true power doesn't shout, it doesn't plead, it doesn't beg to be understood. True power knows when to walk away and stay silent, because it no longer needs the approval of those who never had the right to define it. Asterisk, asterisk.